Whispers of Kursk, a world of shadows. In the summer of 1943, deep within the forests of western Russia, a peculiar sight would have greeted any observer fortunate enough to witness it. A freight train, nearly a kilometer long, sat motionless among towering birch and pine trees. But this was no ordinary train, and this was no ordinary forest. Every car had been painstakingly draped with cut branches, woven nets, and carefully arranged foliage. The locomotive itself disappeared beneath a canopy of green, its massive bulk rendered nearly invisible from above. Sunlight filtered through the genuine leaves overhead, casting dappled shadows across the artificial camouflage below, creating an illusion so complete that even from 100 meters away, the eye struggled to distinguish steel from timber, machinery from nature. This train was but one small thread in what would become the most elaborate deception operation in military history. A web of lies, misdirection, and theatrical illusion that would determine the fate of nations. The Russians had a word for it, maskirovka, and in the sweltering heat of that summer, as Hitler's armies prepared for their final desperate gamble on the Eastern Front, Soviet commanders were orchestrating a performance that would make the greatest stage magicians seem like mere amateurs. The year 1943 found the German Wehrmacht at a crossroads. 2 years had passed since Operation Barbarossa had torn across the Soviet frontier like a steel hurricane. 2 years since German tanks had rolled toward Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad with what seemed like unstoppable momentum. But the unstoppable had been stopped. The invincible had been humbled. At Stalingrad, an entire German army had simply ceased to exist, swallowed by the rubble and the Russian winter. Now, as spring turned to summer, Adolf Hitler faced a terrible arithmetic. His armies were bleeding strength with each passing day, while Soviet factories beyond the Urals churned out tanks, aircraft, and artillery at a pace that defied comprehension. The German High Command needed a victory. Not just any victory, but a crushing, decisive blow that would shatter Soviet resistance and perhaps force Stalin to seek terms. They found their answer in a bulge of Russian territory that jutted westward into German-held lines near the city of Kursk. Here, they reasoned, lay opportunity. A massive pincer movement, striking from north and south simultaneously, could encircle and destroy perhaps 1 million Soviet troops. Operation Citadel, they called it, and they began massing the largest concentration of armored power the world had ever seen. But if the Germans were planning their greatest offensive, the Soviets were preparing their greatest deception. And that camouflaged train in the forest was just the beginning. To understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold, one must first grasp the sheer scale of the Eastern Front. This was not the relatively compact battlefield of Western Europe, where armies maneuvered across distances measured in dozens of kilometers. The front line from the Baltic to the Black Sea stretched for over 2,000 kilometers, a distance greater than from New York to Denver. Along this vast expanse, millions of men faced each other across minefields, trenches, and fortified positions that had been months in the making. The Kursk salient itself was roughly the size of England, a bulge in the lines that extended nearly 200 kilometers from north to south and protruded some 150 kilometers into German-held territory. Within this pocket, the Red Army had positioned substantial forces, but their exact strength and disposition remained a mystery that German intelligence officers struggled desperately to solve. What those intelligence officers could not have known was that they were attempting to peer through a veil woven by masters of deception. Soviet maskirovka was not simply camouflage or concealment. It was an art form that encompassed every aspect of military operations. Radio transmissions were carefully orchestrated to suggest troop movements that never occurred. Dummy tanks, constructed from plywood and canvas, appeared in aerial photographs exactly where German planners expected to find them. Real units vanished as if they had never existed, while phantom armies materialized from thin air. The architect of this grand deception was not a single individual, but rather a collective of Soviet staff officers who had learned bitter lessons during the early disasters of 1941. They had watched as German intelligence had seemingly anticipated every Soviet move, as Luftwaffe bombers had found their airfields with uncanny precision, as Panzer spearheads had struck exactly where defenses were weakest. Never again, they vowed, would the enemy see clearly into Soviet intentions. The planning for Kursk began in the spring of 1943, Even as the last snows were melting across the steppes, Soviet commanders faced a fundamental choice. Should they strike first, attempting to disrupt German preparations, or should they allow the enemy to attack and meet them with prepared defenses? The decision to adopt a defensive strategy was not born from weakness, but from a cold calculation of advantages. If the Germans could be drawn into attacking prepared positions, their offensive power would be bled away against successive lines of defense. Then, when they were exhausted and overextended, the Red Army would unleash its own offensive with fresh reserves that the enemy never knew existed. But for this strategy to succeed, the Germans had to believe they were attacking a weakened, demoralized enemy. They had to see exactly what Soviet planners wanted them to see, and nothing more. The camouflaged train in the forest was carrying T-34 tanks. Dozens of them, fresh from the factories of Nizhny Tagil, their steel still bearing the smell of the foundries. But according to German intelligence assessments, no such tanks existed in this sector. On paper, in radio intercepts, in the carefully managed observations of German reconnaissance aircraft, this train had never departed its origin point. The tanks it carried were ghosts, and they would remain ghosts until the moment they emerged from concealment to strike. This was the essence of maskirovka, not merely hiding what existed, but creating an entirely false picture of reality. Soviet engineers had spent weeks preparing concealed positions throughout the forests surrounding Kursk. Tank parks were dug into hillsides and covered with earth and vegetation. Artillery positions were constructed with multiple false sites for every real one. Supply dumps were scattered and hidden so thoroughly that even Soviet troops sometimes struggled to locate them without detailed maps. Meanwhile, in areas where the Germans expected to see activity, they found exactly what their preconceptions suggested should be there. Dummy positions sprouted like mushrooms after rain. Radio operators transmitted according to scripts designed to suggest units that existed only in German intelligence files. Vehicles moved along predetermined routes at carefully calculated intervals, creating patterns of activity that reinforced enemy assumptions. The human cost of maintaining such elaborate deceptions was enormous. Every soldier involved had to understand not just his own role, but how that role fit into the larger illusion. Radio discipline had to be perfect. A single unauthorized transmission could unravel weeks of careful preparation. Movement had to follow precise schedules. A supply convoy arriving at the wrong time could reveal the location of a concealed unit. Even the most mundane activities, from cooking fires to latrines, had to be managed to avoid creating signatures that enemy observers might detect. Soviet commanders understood that their German counterparts were highly skilled professionals who would exploit any inconsistency or oversight. The Wehrmacht's intelligence apparatus had proven its competence during 2 years of successful operations. German pilots were experienced at spotting camouflage. German radio intercept specialists could extract remarkable amounts of information from seemingly innocent transmissions. German agents, though few in number behind Soviet lines, were trained to observe and report on exactly the kinds of details that could expose deception operations. Against such opponents, there could be no half measures. The illusion had to be complete, consistent, and maintained without fail until the moment of truth arrived. As June progressed into July, the scale of German preparations became impossible to conceal. Aerial reconnaissance revealed massive concentrations of armor, artillery, and infantry forming up in staging areas north and south of the Kursk salient. New airfields appeared seemingly overnight as the Luftwaffe positioned thousands of aircraft for the coming offensive. Supply convoys stretched back for hundreds of kilometers as the Wehrmacht accumulated the ammunition, fuel, and equipment necessary for Operation Citadel. The Germans made no serious attempt to hide their preparations, and why should they? In their experience, the Red Army was incapable of the kind of coordinated response that might disrupt a carefully planned offensive. Soviet forces would fight with their characteristic stubbornness, certainly, but they would fight in the wrong places, with inadequate preparation, and without the reserves necessary to sustain prolonged resistance. Or so German intelligence assessments concluded. What they could not see, hidden beneath the canopy of that vast forest, were the preparations for a different kind of warfare entirely. A warfare of shadows and mirrors, where nothing was as it seemed and every assumption would be turned against those who held it. The camouflaged train sat motionless in the dappled sunlight, its cargo of steel sleeping in the summer heat. Soon, very soon, those tanks would wake, and with them the world would witness the true power of Maskirovka unleashed. Constructing illusions, the dummy airfields. The construction began at dawn, 300 kilometers south of Moscow, where the morning mist still clung to empty fields that would soon become something they were not. Colonel Viktor Petrov stood at the edge of what appeared to be barren farmland, his breath visible in the cool air as he surveyed the terrain with the calculating eye of an architect, though what he was about to build would never shelter a soul. In his weathered hands, he held blueprints that told a story of deception, not the clean, precise drawings of engineers constructing something meant to last, but rough sketches annotated with phrases like visible from 2,000 meters and shadow pattern, morning light. These were the technical specifications for an illusion. By 8 o'clock, the first trucks had arrived, their engines coughing diesel smoke into the crisp air. From their beds came not steel and concrete, but materials that spoke to a different kind of construction entirely. Wooden planks cut to specific lengths and angles. Rolls of canvas dyed in the mottled greens and browns that would catch a reconnaissance pilot's eye from 30,000 feet. Bundles of straw tied with rough rope that would become the texture of authenticity when viewed through a camera lens. The workers who unloaded these materials moved with the purposeful urgency of men who understood that time was not merely precious, it was survival itself. They were not construction workers in any traditional sense. Some were theater set designers, conscripted from Moscow's stages where they had once created backdrops for Chekhov and Pushkin. Others were farmers who understood how light fell across open fields at different hours of the day. A few were artists, painters who knew how shadows could lie and how perspective could deceive the human eye. What they were building was an airfield that would never see an aircraft land upon it. The process began with the runways themselves, long strips of packed earth carefully graded to appear smooth from above, but constructed from nothing more than local soil mixed with ash to create the right color contrast. The workers moved in teams, some smoothing the surface with improvised tools, others following behind with stencils and dark paint to create the illusion of wear patterns, the subtle marks that real aircraft would leave after months of operations. As the morning progressed, the dummy aircraft began to take shape. These were perhaps the most crucial elements of the deception, and their construction required a peculiar blend of craftsmanship and theatrical imagination. The framework came first. Wooden skeletons that approximated the dimensions of Soviet fighters and bombers, but built with the economy of stage props rather than the precision of actual aircraft. Master Sergeant Dmitry Volkov, who had spent 20 years building furniture in Leningrad before the war, found himself becoming an expert in the construction of fake Yak-1 fighters. His hands, accustomed to crafting tables and chairs that would last generations, now worked with materials designed to fool the enemy for just long enough. Canvas stretched over wooden frames, painted with the careful attention to detail that would make a reconnaissance photograph show exactly what German intelligence expected to see. The wings required particular attention. Real aircraft cast specific shadows, and those shadows told stories to trained photo interpreters. Too thin, and the deception would be obvious. Too thick, and the silhouette would be wrong. Volkov and his team experimented with different padding techniques, stuffing straw beneath the canvas to create the proper dimensional illusion, then testing their work by photographing it from improvised towers that simulated the altitude of enemy reconnaissance flights. By midday, the field had transformed into something that resembled organized chaos. Teams worked on different aspects of the illusion simultaneously, their efforts coordinated by officers who moved between groups with the intensity of theater directors managing a complex production. Because that, in essence, was exactly what this was, a performance staged for an audience of German pilots and photo analysts who would never know they were watching a carefully choreographed lie. The fuel depot required its own specialized construction. Real airfields needed fuel storage, and the absence of such facilities would immediately mark this installation as false. But constructing actual fuel tanks would waste precious resources needed elsewhere. Instead, the team built hollow shells from wood and canvas, positioned to cast the right shadows and painted to show the weathering patterns that genuine fuel storage would display after months of use. The attention to detail extended to elements that seemed almost absurd in their specificity. Pathways between buildings were worn into the earth by teams of workers walking predetermined routes, creating the foot traffic patterns that aerial photography would reveal at active airbases. Laundry lines were strung between dummy barracks, with actual clothing hung out to dry, because real airfields housed real people, and real people left traces of daily life that trained observers would look for. As afternoon approached, the work took on an almost frantic quality. Not because the workers were behind schedule, but because the illusion they were creating had to account for the changing light conditions that would affect how it appeared from above. Canvas that looked convincing in morning light might appear obviously fake in the harsh glare of midday sun, or in the long shadows of evening reconnaissance flights. The painters worked with particular urgency, mixing pigments to match not just the colors of real military equipment, but the specific ways those colors would appear when photographed through the filters and film stocks used by German reconnaissance aircraft. They had studied captured examples of enemy aerial photography, learning to see their work through hostile eyes, understanding that their success would be measured not by how convincing their illusions appeared to friendly observers on the ground, but by how completely they could fool trained intelligence analysts studying grainy photographs in distant offices. By evening, as the summer sun began its descent toward the horizon, the transformation was nearly complete. What had been an empty field that morning now appeared to be a fully operational Soviet airbase, complete with aircraft, fuel storage, defensive positions, and all the infrastructure that would support a significant military presence. But the most crucial test was yet to come. As darkness approached, the field would need to demonstrate the patterns of light discipline that characterized real military installations. Too much light, and it would appear to be a decoy operation. Too little, and it would seem abandoned. The lighting had to suggest the careful balance of operational necessity and security consciousness that marked genuine airbases operating under wartime conditions. The workers who had labored through the day now prepared for a different kind of performance, one that would play out night after night, as long as the deception needed to be maintained. Small fires would be lit and extinguished according to carefully planned schedules. Lights would appear in windows of dummy buildings, suggesting the presence of personnel following realistic duty rotations. As the first stars appeared overhead, Colonel Petrov walked the perimeter of his creation one final time, seeing it now not as the collection of wood, canvas, and carefully applied paint that it truly was, but as the German reconnaissance pilots would see it in tomorrow's dawn light. A legitimate target, a concentration of Soviet air power that demanded attention, resources, and perhaps most importantly, bombs that would fall on empty fields instead of genuine military assets. The dummy airfield was complete. The performance was ready to begin. Eyes in the shadows, observation and misdirection. 20 kilometers northeast of the dummy airfield, Senior Lieutenant Viktor Petrov adjusted his field glasses and settled deeper into the earth-carved observation post that had been his world for the past 6 weeks. The bunker, barely large enough for 2 men, represented the invisible nervous system of the Soviet deception network, a web of watchers whose patient eyes formed the foundation upon which all Maskirovka depended. The setting sun painted the western horizon in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the rolling steppe. To any passing observer, this hillside appeared unremarkable. Another gentle rise covered in summer grass and wild flowers. But beneath the carefully maintained camouflage of sod and branches, Petrov commanded a view that stretched 15 kilometers in every direction. His post was one of hundreds, each positioned with mathematical precision to create overlapping fields of observation that missed nothing. The art of military observation required a particular temperament. It demanded men who could remain motionless for hours, who found satisfaction in the accumulation of seemingly insignificant details, who understood that the difference between victory and defeat often lay in correctly interpreting the movement of a single vehicle on a distant road. Petrov possessed these qualities in abundance. Before the war, he had been a geography teacher in Tula, accustomed to studying maps and understanding how terrain shaped human movement. Now he applied those same analytical skills to reading the landscape for signs of German activity. Every dust cloud, every glint of metal, Every change in routine became data to be recorded, analyzed, and transmitted back to headquarters. His logbook, wrapped in oiled cloth and secured in a metal box, contained 6 weeks of meticulous entries: vehicle counts, aircraft movements, the timing of supply convoys, the establishment of new positions. Each observation was cross-referenced with reports from neighboring posts, creating a comprehensive picture of German preparations that Soviet intelligence officers assembled like pieces of an enormous puzzle. But observation posts served a dual purpose in the Maskirovka system. They were not merely passive collectors of information, they were active participants in the deception. When German reconnaissance aircraft appeared on the horizon, posts like Petrov's became theatrical directors, orchestrating carefully rehearsed scenes designed to reinforce false impressions. The radio crackled softly. "Raven's Nest, this is Eagle's Eye. 2 aircraft approaching from the southwest. Altitude approximately 800 meters." Petrov reached for his field telephone, cranking the handle twice. The connection to the dummy airfield was immediate. "Curtain call in 3 minutes," he said simply. The code phrase would trigger a burst of activity below. Canvas covers would be pulled from aircraft mock-ups. Vehicles would begin moving along predetermined routes. Smoke would rise from cooking fires. In moments, the empty field would appear to bustle with the activity of a fully operational airbase. This choreographed deception required split-second timing and absolute precision. Too much activity would appear suspicious, too little would fail to convince. The observers had spent weeks studying German reconnaissance patterns, learning the altitude at which different details became visible. Understanding the limitations of aerial photography, they knew that from 800 meters, a trained observer could distinguish between real and fake aircraft only if the deception contained specific flaws. Shadows falling in wrong directions, proportions slightly off, or movements that defied military logic. The German aircraft passed overhead, their engines creating a distant drone that gradually faded toward the eastern horizon. Petrov made careful notes about their heading, estimated speed, and the duration of their observation passes. This information would be invaluable for planning future deceptions. Understanding enemy reconnaissance schedules allowed Soviet forces to time their real movements for periods when German eyes were looking elsewhere. As twilight deepened, Petrov's partner, Sergeant Mikhail Volkov, emerged from the post's deeper chamber, where he had been monitoring radio transmissions. Volkov possessed an extraordinary gift for languages and signals intelligence. He could identify German radio operators by their distinctive transmission styles, track the movement of enemy units by monitoring their communication patterns, and most importantly, feed carefully crafted false information into German intelligence networks. The Phantom Regiment reported successful engagement near Panayri. Volkov reported with quiet satisfaction. The Phantom Regiment existed only in radio transmissions and carefully planted documents, but German intelligence had been tracking its supposed movements for 3 weeks. Tonight's fictional battle report would reinforce German misconceptions about Soviet defensive positions while drawing attention away from actual troop concentrations. Creating phantom armies required extraordinary attention to detail. Each fictional unit needed a complete identity. Commanders with believable backgrounds, supply requirements that matched their supposed size, communication patterns consistent with their alleged mission. Radio operators like Volkov spent hours crafting authentic-sounding transmissions, complete with technical difficulties, personality quirks, and the mundane administrative chatter that characterized real military communications. The psychological dimension of this work was profound. Men like Petrov and Volkov lived in a world where truth and falsehood blended seamlessly. They observed genuine enemy movements while simultaneously creating fictional friendly forces. They reported accurate intelligence while crafting elaborate lies. The mental discipline required to maintain these parallel realities, to remember which information was real and which was manufactured, demanded exceptional clarity of purpose. As full darkness settled over the steppe, Petrov began his night observations. German forces often moved under cover of darkness, believing themselves invisible to Soviet surveillance. They underestimated the extent of the observation network and the skill of men trained to detect movement by sound, by the subtle blocking of stars, by the faint vibrations transmitted through the Earth itself. Tonight brought unusual activity. Vehicle engines hummed in the distance. their sound carrying clearly through the still air. Petrov counted the distinct engine notes, estimating the size and composition of the convoy. His trained ear could distinguish between the deep rumble of tanks, the higher pitch of trucks, and the distinctive whine of armored cars. Each sound signature provided clues about German intentions and capabilities. The convoy passed without stopping, heading northeast toward positions that Soviet intelligence had been monitoring for days. Petrov noted the time, direction, and estimated strength in his logbook. This information would be transmitted at the next scheduled communication window, adding another piece to the vast intelligence mosaic being assembled at headquarters. In the profound quiet that followed, Petrov reflected on the strange nature of his war. Unlike the infantry who faced the enemy directly, or the tank crews who engaged in dramatic armored duels, his battle was fought with patience, observation, and carefully constructed lies. Victory came not through destruction, but through misdirection, through convincing the enemy to attack empty fields while real forces remained hidden, through creating fictional threats that drew resources away from genuine objectives. The observation posts represented the nervous system of Maskirovka, but they also embodied its philosophy. War was not merely about superior firepower or tactical brilliance. It was about understanding your enemy's mind well enough to manipulate it, about creating a reality so convincing that your opponent would make decisions based on your illusions rather than actual facts. As the night deepened and the stars emerged in brilliant clarity above the steppe, Petrov continued his vigil. Somewhere in the darkness, German observers were conducting their own surveillance, trying to penetrate Soviet deceptions while crafting their own. It was a war of shadows and whispers, fought by patient men in hidden places, where the greatest victories were achieved when the enemy never realized they had been deceived at all. Empty trenches and silent fields. The first light of dawn revealed what German reconnaissance pilots had been reporting for weeks. Empty trenches stretching across the Ukrainian steppe like abandoned scars in the earth. These defensive positions, photographed and mapped with meticulous German precision, appeared to tell a clear story of Soviet withdrawal, or perhaps Soviet weakness. The trenches wound through fields of young wheat, their earthen walls already beginning to slump and collapse in places as if nature itself was reclaiming these forgotten fortifications. But appearances, as the Soviets understood better than most, could be carefully orchestrated deceptions. Colonel Heinrich Weber of the Wehrmacht's intelligence corps had studied these photographs until his eyes ached. The images showed trench systems that followed textbook defensive doctrine, properly angled firing positions, communication trenches connecting strong points, even the telltale spoil patterns that indicated recent construction. Yet something felt wrong. The trenches were too perfect in their abandonment, too conveniently empty for German observation flights to photograph and catalogue. What Weber couldn't know, studying his aerial photographs in a command bunker hundreds of kilometers away, was that these empty trenches were themselves a form of battlefield theater. Soviet engineers had constructed them with the same attention to detail that went into their dummy airfields and phantom tank formations. Every collapsed section had been carefully planned, every apparent sign of hasty evacuation deliberately staged. The real Soviet defensive positions lay elsewhere, hidden beneath layers of camouflage so sophisticated that German pilots flew directly over them without recognition. While photographers captured images of abandoned trenches, the true defensive network remained invisible. A maze of concealed firing positions, underground command posts, and camouflaged artillery emplacements that would soon transform the German advance into a carefully orchestrated killing ground. Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Volkov crouched in one of these hidden positions, barely 300 meters from the abandoned trenches that had captured so much German attention. His observation post was a masterpiece of concealment, built into a natural depression and covered with living sod that had been carefully transplanted to match the surrounding steppe grass. Even from 50 meters away, the position was virtually undetectable. Through his periscope, Volkov could see the empty trenches that German intelligence found so interesting. The morning sun cast long shadows across their earthen walls, creating patterns of light and darkness that seemed to emphasize their desolate abandonment. Wheat stalks had already begun growing in the bottom of some sections, adding to the impression that these positions had been deserted for weeks. The illusion was so complete that even Volkov, who knew the truth, found himself momentarily convinced by the deception. The empty trenches possessed an eerie quality, like stage sets after the actors had departed, leaving only the props and painted backdrops of a performance that had ended before the audience arrived. But this performance was far from over. The empty trenches were merely the opening act in a much larger production, one that would soon involve hundreds of thousands of performers in a deadly choreography of advance and retreat, attack and defense. The German forces massing for Operation Citadel believed they understood the stage, believed they had identified where the Soviets were strong and where they were weak. They were about to discover how thoroughly they had been deceived. The art of battlefield camouflage had evolved dramatically since the early days of the war, when Soviet forces had relied on crude attempts at concealment that fooled no one. Now teams of specialists worked with the precision of master craftsmen, understanding that effective deception required not just hiding what existed, but creating convincing evidence of what did not exist. Captain Boris Antonov supervised one such team, a mixed group of engineers, artists, and local farmers who had become experts in the subtle craft of military theater. Their current project involved creating the appearance of a major ammunition depot in an area the Soviets actually intended to abandon. The depot looked convincing from the air. Neat rows of camouflaged bunkers, supply roads worn by heavy traffic, even the scorch marks and blast patterns that suggested recent German air attacks. In reality, the bunkers contained nothing but logs and sandbags. The supply roads had been artificially aged using techniques borrowed from film studios. The blast patterns had been created with small charges and carefully scattered debris. Every detail was designed to convince German intelligence that they had located a critical Soviet supply hub, one that would inevitably become a priority target for the coming offensive. While German bombers would waste precious fuel and ordnance attacking this elaborate fiction, the real Soviet ammunition depots remained hidden in forests and valleys that didn't appear on any German map. The deception would not only protect vital supplies, but would also provide Soviet intelligence with valuable information about German targeting priorities and attack patterns. The empty trenches served a similar purpose, drawing German attention away from the true defensive preparations while providing a false sense of confidence about Soviet capabilities. German planners, studying their reconnaissance photographs, would see evidence of hasty Soviet withdrawals and incomplete defensive preparations. They would adjust their attack plans accordingly, concentrating forces against positions that existed only in their imagination, while remaining blind to the real threats that awaited them. As the morning progressed, the wheat fields around the empty trenches began to shimmer in the rising heat. The abandoned earthworks seemed to drowse in the warmth, their shadows shortening as the sun climbed higher. Occasionally, a bird would land on the crumbling parapet of a firing position, adding to the impression of long abandonment and neglect. But beneath this peaceful surface, the steppe was alive with hidden activity. Soviet soldiers moved through concealed tunnels that connected their real defensive positions. Artillery crews made final adjustments to guns hidden beneath camouflage nets so sophisticated that German aerial observers had photographed them repeatedly without recognition. Tank crews waited in carefully prepared hull-down positions, their vehicles invisible even from a few dozen meters away. The contrast between appearance and reality had become so complete that the battlefield existed on multiple levels simultaneously. There was the battlefield that German intelligence believed they understood, marked by empty trenches, abandoned positions, and evidence of Soviet weakness. And there was the real battlefield, a complex network of hidden fortifications and concealed forces that would soon reveal itself with devastating effect. Lieutenant Volkov adjusted his periscope and continued his patient observation of the empty trenches. Soon, German infantry would advance across these fields, confident in their intelligence reports and their understanding of Soviet dispositions. They would occupy the abandoned positions, establish their own defensive lines, and prepare for the next phase of their advance. Only then would they begin to understand the true nature of the trap that had been prepared for them. The empty trenches would become killing grounds, exposed positions from which there would be no easy retreat. The abandoned earthworks would transform from apparent Soviet weakness into German vulnerability, as hidden Soviet guns found their carefully predetermined ranges. The morning sun continued its slow climb across the Ukrainian sky, warming the empty trenches and the fields of wheat that surrounded them. In a few hours, this peaceful scene would be transformed into something very different. But for now, the steppe remained quiet, deceptively calm, waiting for the storm that would soon test every element of the elaborate deception that had taken months to prepare. The empty trenches held their secrets, and their silence spoke volumes to those who knew how to listen. Hand weaving the web, the hands behind the illusion. But the empty trenches were only one thread in a tapestry far more intricate than any German reconnaissance could imagine. Miles away from the false positions, in barns and workshops scattered across the Soviet countryside, other hands were weaving their own form of deception, hands that would never hold rifles, but whose work would prove just as crucial to the defense of the motherland. In a converted grain barn outside the village of Ponieri, the morning light filtered through weathered wooden slats, casting long golden bars across a scene of quiet industry. Here dozens of women bent over their work, their fingers moving with practiced precision through strips of burlap, canvas, and carefully dried branches. The air was thick with the scent of hemp rope and pine needles, the raw materials of military invisibility. These were the camouflage net workshops, operations that existed in the shadows of official military records, yet without which the entire maskirovka would have been impossible. The women who worked here came from all walks of Soviet life. Former textile workers whose factories had been evacuated eastward, teachers whose schools had been transformed into field hospitals, mothers whose sons were already fighting somewhere along the endless front. Maria Volkov, a supervisor who had once managed a carpet-weaving cooperative in Leningrad, moved between the workstations with the eye of someone who understood that precision here could mean survival for thousands of soldiers. She paused beside young Katya, barely 18, whose nimble fingers were threading dried grass through a base of coarse netting. The spacing must be irregular, Maria reminded her gently. Nature never creates perfect patterns. The German pilots, they're trained to spot anything that looks too orderly, too deliberate. The technique was deceptively complex. Each net required not just the right materials, but an understanding of how light and shadow would fall across it from above. The women had to think like aerial photographers, to imagine how their handiwork would appear through the lens of a reconnaissance camera at 20,000 feet. Too uniform, and it would betray itself as artificial. Too sparse, and it would fail to conceal what lay beneath. In the corner of the barn, elderly Pavel Dmitrievich sat surrounded by bundles of birch and oak branches, carefully sorting them by size and color. His gnarled hands, weathered by decades of farming, now served a different harvest. Each branch had to be selected for how it would age, how its leaves would curl and brown in a way that matched the natural camouflage of the steppe. "The Germans think they understand our land," he murmured to no one in particular, his voice barely audible above the rustle of foliage. "But they see it only from above, from their machines. We know how it breathes, how it changes with each hour of the day." The work required a peculiar form of artistry. These were not simply coverings, but three-dimensional illusions designed to fool cameras and human eyes trained in the science of detection. Some nets were crafted to make occupied positions appear empty, others to make empty ground seem bustling with activity. The most sophisticated were designed to create false shadows, suggesting the presence of equipment that existed only in the imagination of German intelligence officers. As the morning wore on, the barn filled with the soft sounds of collaboration. Women shared techniques passed down through generations of textile work, adapted now for military necessity. A grandmother who had woven rugs for the Tsar's army in the Great War found her skills suddenly relevant again. A young art student, evacuated from Moscow, applied her understanding of perspective and visual perception to the challenge of aerial deception. The materials themselves told stories of a nation mobilized. Strips of fabric came from clothing that families could no longer spare whole garments. Canvas was salvaged from tents, sails, and awnings. Even the thread was precious, carefully hoarded from peacetime sewing projects, now serving the war effort one strand at a time. But perhaps most remarkable was the knowledge these women accumulated, an informal intelligence network that flowed through their conversations as they worked. News from the front lines passed along through letters from sons and husbands. Updates on German reconnaissance patterns filtered down from military observers who had learned to read the sky for signs of approaching aircraft. weather predictions that would affect how quickly their nets would weather and blend with the landscape. This information shaped their work in ways no military manual could capture. They knew that German pilots preferred to photograph during certain hours when shadows were most revealing. They understood which seasons made their handiwork most vulnerable to detection. They had learned to incorporate these insights into every net they wove, creating camouflage that was not just visually convincing, but temporally sophisticated. In another workshop, several kilometers away, a different group focused on what the military called signature management, the art of controlling heat patterns that might be detected by German infrared equipment. These women worked with materials that would absorb and dissipate thermal energy, creating false heat signatures that could make a cold position appear occupied, or a busy headquarters seem abandoned. The science was crude by later standards, but the intuition was profound. These craftswomen understood that deception operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Visual camouflage was only the beginning. True invisibility required fooling every sense and instrument the enemy might employ. As afternoon approached, the completed nets were carefully bundled and prepared for transport. Each package was labeled with cryptic markings that indicated not just its destination, but its intended purpose in the larger deception. Some would be deployed around the false positions that German intelligence had already begun to catalogue. Others would conceal the real defensive works that remained invisible to enemy observation. The women rarely knew exactly where their work would be used. Operational security demanded such compartmentalization, but they understood its importance with an intimacy that transcended official briefings. Their sons, brothers, and husbands would take shelter beneath these nets. The success or failure of their weaving might determine whether those men lived or died in the coming battle. As the golden light of late afternoon slanted through the barn walls, the workshop began to quiet. Tomorrow would bring another day of weaving, another contribution to the vast illusion taking shape across the Kursk salient. But for now, there was satisfaction in work completed, in knowing that their hands had added another thread to the web that might yet trap the German offensive. The camouflage nets would soon take their places in the elaborate theater of Maskirovka, silent witnesses to the power of collective deception, woven by hands that understood the deepest truth of warfare. That victory often belongs not to the strongest, but to those who can make the enemy see what they wish them to see. In the gathering dusk, the barn fell silent, but the work continued in workshops across the region as countless hands prepared the stage for the greatest deception in military history. The river of deceit. The greatest deceptions, however, were not hidden in forests or buried in earth, but stretched across the flowing waters that carved the landscape into strategic corridors. Rivers had always been the arteries of warfare, and the Soviets understood that German planners would scrutinize every crossing point, every bridge, every ford that might channel their massive offensive. Along the Sel River, 30 kilometers south of the main defensive positions, Soviet engineers began constructing what appeared to be a critical supply route. The pontoon bridge emerged from the western bank with military precision, each floating section anchored with proper spacing, the roadway planked with regulation timber. German reconnaissance flights would photograph the structure week after week, watching its steady progress across the dark water. But the bridge told a lie with every plank, stretching exactly halfway across the river before ending abruptly in empty air. The deception was breathtakingly audacious. From above, at the altitude of German reconnaissance aircraft, the incomplete bridge appeared to be under construction, a vital crossing that would soon connect the Soviet rear areas to their forward positions. Luftwaffe analysts marked it on their maps as a priority target, calculating the tonnage required to destroy it, the fighter escorts needed for bombing runs. Below, the river flowed with ancient patience, carrying fragments of wood and debris that the engineers scattered deliberately downstream. The banks were lined with tall reeds and grasses that swayed in the summer breeze, providing natural concealment for the teams that maintained this theatrical masterpiece. Each morning, Soviet workers would arrive at the site, their movements carefully choreographed for the cameras they knew were watching from above. They carried tools and materials, gestured toward the incomplete span, and performed the elaborate pantomime of construction. Yet no progress was ever made. The bridge remained frozen at its halfway point, a monument to strategic misdirection. The psychological effect on German planning was precisely calculated. Intelligence officers in Army Group Center spent countless hours analyzing photographs of the bridge, estimating completion dates, assessing its capacity for Soviet reinforcements. They allocated precious Stuka dive bombers to attack a target that posed no actual threat, diverting resources from the real crossing points hidden kilometers away. Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Volkov, the engineer responsible for the Phantom Bridge, understood the deeper mathematics of deception. Every German bomb dropped on his useless pontoons was a bomb that would not fall on genuine Soviet positions. Every reconnaissance flight photographing his incomplete span was missing the camouflaged fords where real reinforcements would cross when the battle began. The river itself became a co-conspirator in the deception, its surface reflecting the summer sky in ways that obscured the true nature of what lay beneath. Soviet divers had positioned additional pontoon sections just below the waterline, creating the illusion of submerged construction materials. German photo interpreters, studying their images through magnifying glasses, would conclude that the Soviets were stockpiling bridge components for rapid completion. As July approached and the German offensive loomed, the Phantom Bridge took on an almost surreal quality, a structure that existed in the space between reality and illusion. It was real enough to photograph, substantial enough to bomb, yet ultimately as insubstantial as morning mist. The reeds along the riverbank whispered secrets to the flowing water, secrets about the true crossing points, about the genuine supply routes, about the massive defensive preparations hidden beyond German sight. But the river kept these secrets, carrying only the false evidence downstream, fragments of a deception so complete that even the landscape seemed to participate in the grand illusion. In the gathering twilight, the incomplete bridge cast its broken shadow across the water, a testament to the power of strategic misdirection, where the most convincing lies were built not from words, but from wood and steel and the patient flow of ancient waters. And the guns of silence. Beyond the river's deceptive currents, deeper in the forest where ancient oaks had witnessed centuries of conflict, another form of maskirovka waited in perfect stillness. Here, among the dappled shadows and filtered sunlight, the true guardians of Soviet defensive strategy lay hidden, not in trenches or behind earthworks, but in groves that seemed untouched by war. The artillery pieces rested like sleeping giants beneath their canopy of leaves and netting. Each gun barrel, capable of hurling death across miles of battlefield, wore a shroud of carefully woven camouflage that transformed steel into shadow. The netting itself was a masterpiece of concealment, not the crude covering of desperate soldiers, but the calculated artistry of military engineers who understood that survival depended on invisibility. Beneath the guns, the earth told its own story of preparation. Mud and ruts spoke of careful positioning, tracks that led nowhere the enemy could see, yet everywhere the defenders needed to be. Each wheelmark had been considered, each footprint planned. The ground itself had become part of the deception, showing just enough evidence of activity to seem natural, yet concealing the true scope of the firepower nestled among the trees. The gunners moved like ghosts through their forest sanctuary, their movements synchronized with the rhythm of wind through leaves. They had learned to become part of the landscape, to breathe with the forest, to think like the trees themselves. Their uniforms bore the stains of bark and earth, their faces streaked with the colors of shadow and sunlight. They were no longer merely soldiers, they had become extensions of the maskirovka itself. But the artillery was only part of a larger theatrical production. Beyond the gun positions, where the forest opened into a natural clearing, another scene played out in the afternoon light. A column of tanks sat in formation, their metal surfaces catching the sun's rays in ways that suggested power and readiness. To German reconnaissance aircraft circling high above, they appeared as a significant armored reserve, a threat that demanded attention and resources. Yet these tanks told a different story to those who knew how to read the signs. Some bore the scars of battles already fought, their armor patched and repaired, their tracks worn smooth by countless miles. Others showed the telltale signs of careful restoration, fresh paint applied over old wounds, new markings painted over faded ones. They were veterans given new life through the patient work of maintenance crews who understood that in Maskirovka, even the broken could serve. The sun moved across the sky, and with each passing hour, the light revealed new details of the deception. A tank that looked formidable from one angle showed its true condition from another: disabled tracks hidden by careful positioning, damaged turrets concealed by strategic shadows. But from above, from the perspective that mattered most, they remained a convincing force. A phantom army that would draw German attention away from the real preparations happening elsewhere. The crews assigned to these positions understood their role in the greater performance. They maintained the illusion with the dedication of actors who knew that a single mistake could bring the curtain down on the entire production. They polished metal that would never fire, cleaned weapons that would never shoot, and prepared for battles they would never fight. All so that their comrades in the real positions could strike with devastating surprise. As evening approached, the forest settled into its ancient rhythm of concealment and patience. The guns remained silent, their crews watchful. The phantom tanks continued their motionless vigil, and somewhere in the distance, German planners studied their maps and photographs, making decisions based on shadows and illusions, never suspecting that the very landscape had become their enemy's greatest weapon. The Maskirovka held its breath, waiting for the moment when silence would give way to thunder. Echoes of illusion, Kursk's lingering mystery. And so the great deception reached its crescendo, not in the thunder of artillery or the clash of armor, but in the profound silence that precedes revelation. In a radio communication tent hidden beneath layers of camouflage netting, Soviet officers monitored the frequencies, listening to the distant chatter of German units that were moving toward targets that existed only in carefully crafted illusion. The radio operator, a young woman whose steady hands had guided countless phantom messages across the airwaves, adjusted her headset and continued the delicate work of maintaining the grand deception. Her voice, when she spoke into the microphone, carried the weight of entire phantom divisions, ghost battalions that lived only in the electromagnetic spectrum, yet seemed as real to German intelligence as the morning mist that clung to the Russian steppes. Through the tent's concealed opening, the first hints of dawn began to filter through the forest canopy. That same ancient forest that had sheltered the camouflaged train, the hidden artillery positions, the patient observers who had watched and waited through the long nights of preparation. The trees themselves had become conspirators in this elaborate theater of war, their branches and shadows serving as both curtain and stage for the greatest military deception of the modern age. As the light grew stronger, it illuminated a landscape transformed by human ingenuity and desperation, a terrain where nothing was quite what it seemed. The dummy airfield, with its canvas aircraft and carefully constructed buildings, caught the early rays of sunlight just as a real airfield would. The phantom tank formations, their metal hulls gleaming with morning dew, maintained their motionless vigil in positions that suggested strength where there was only strategic emptiness. But perhaps the most profound mystery of Maskirovka lay not in what was hidden or what was revealed, but in the spaces between truth and deception, in the twilight realm where reality became fluid and malleable. The Soviet commanders who orchestrated this grand illusion understood something fundamental about the nature of warfare itself, that victory often belonged not to those with the strongest weapons or the most soldiers, but to those who could shape their enemy's perception of reality. In the growing daylight, a field of sunflowers stretched toward the horizon. Their golden faces turned eastward, following the path of the sun as they had for countless summers before this war began. These flowers, innocent and eternal, bore witness to the human drama unfolding around them. Some grew near the real defensive positions, their roots intertwined with the carefully concealed trenches where Soviet soldiers waited. Others bloomed above the decoy positions, their beauty masking the elaborate theatrical constructions beneath. The sunflowers asked no questions about the nature of the deception they witnessed. They simply continued their ancient dance with the light, turning their faces toward truth with the patience that only nature possesses. In their silent testimony lay perhaps the deepest mystery of all, how the organic world of growing things could coexist so peacefully with the manufactured world of military illusion. An abandoned village dozed in the morning light, its empty windows reflecting the sky like unseeing eyes. This village, like so many others across the Kursk salient, had become part of the deception, its apparent emptiness concealing observation posts, its ruined buildings serving as anchor points for camouflage networks that stretched for kilometers in every direction. The villagers who once called this place home had long since fled, but their absence had become another weapon in the Soviet arsenal of illusion. The true genius of Maskirovka revealed itself not in any single deception, but in the way countless small illusions wove together into a tapestry of misdirection so complete that it transformed the very nature of the battlefield. Every element supported every other element. The phantom radio traffic validated the dummy positions. The false supply movements gave credibility to the decoy airfield. The carefully orchestrated civilian activities provided context for the entire elaborate performance. And yet, even now, decades after the last shot was fired at Kursk, questions linger in the spaces between documented fact and strategic mystery. How much of the German intelligence failure stemmed from Soviet deception, and how much from their own preconceptions and wishful thinking? Did the Maskirovka succeed because it was so expertly crafted, or because it told the German commanders what they were already prepared to believe? The radio tent fell silent as the morning shift ended, the last phantom messages dissolving into the ether like morning mist. The operators, their work complete for now, stepped outside into the forest dawn and breathed deeply of air that carried the scent of pine needles and distant sunflowers. They had spent the night weaving illusions, but now they returned to the simple reality of sunlight filtering through leaves, of birds beginning their morning songs, of dew evaporating from grass that grew equally over real positions and false ones. In this return to natural rhythm lay perhaps the most profound truth about the great deception at Kursk. For all its sophistication and strategic importance, Maskirovka remained fundamentally human in its conception and execution. It succeeded not because of technological superiority or overwhelming resources, but because ordinary people, radio operators and artists, farmers and seamstresses, observers and engineers, brought their individual skills and collective determination to bear on an extraordinary challenge. The ghost tank column maintained its silent watch as the sun climbed higher, their metal surfaces warming in the morning light. Some of these vehicles had once been real instruments of war, their crews long since fallen or reassigned to other duties. Now they served a different purpose, their very stillness becoming a form of action, their presence an absence that spoke more loudly than movement ever could. The morning breeze stirred the camouflage netting that draped these phantom machines, creating subtle movements that suggested life where none existed. It was a fitting metaphor for the entire Maskirovka operation, the way that careful preparation and patient execution could breathe apparent life into strategic emptiness, could make absence seem like presence and silence speak louder than thunder. As the day progressed and the great deception continued its patient work, the landscape of Kursk held its secrets close. The real positions remained invisible, their occupants alert but motionless. The false positions continued their elaborate performance, drawing attention and resources away from the true centers of Soviet strength. And in the spaces between truth and illusion, the fate of the Eastern Front hung suspended like morning mist, waiting for the moment when deception would give way to devastating reality. But that moment belonged to the future, to the thunder that would soon roll across these peaceful fields and forests. For now, in the growing warmth of the summer morning, there was only the profound mystery of Maskirovka itself, the way that human creativity and determination could transform an entire landscape into an instrument of strategic deception, the way that patience and careful planning could turn emptiness into a weapon more powerful than any tank or artillery piece. The sunflowers continued their eternal dance with the light, their golden faces reflecting a sun that shone equally on truth and deception, on real positions and phantom ones, on the patient observers who maintained their watch, and the distant planners who studied photographs that revealed everything except what mattered most. In their simple fidelity to the light lay a reminder that beneath all human conflict and strategic complexity, the natural world continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to the elaborate theaters of war that played out across its surface, yet somehow blessing both truth and illusion with the same golden morning light that had witnessed countless summers before this war began, and would witness countless more after its echoes finally faded into the peaceful silence of historical memory.